we could start is, looking at the scramble of for Africa. What are some of the questions we could ask students to find out what they know prior to, or what they knew prior to reading, the text and watching, the documentary King Leopold's. Okay, maybe because we have a map quiz at some point. I think the geography is one way, to approach this. How many states are there, in Africa? And also one other to me, and when I thought about this, like, okay, how many of you students, meaning how many of you can explain the fact that in Africa, so many languages, and a lot of them European, in addition, to the African ones. But how do you explain? Have you ever put any thought into the fact that French, Spanish, Portuguese, help me, what else? German, are spoken in Africa? Does that make sense? Is it logical? How do we explain that? And then also, I'm looking at the last one, outside, besides slavery and the slave trade, have you ever given any thought to the interaction between Africa and the West? So let me pause quickly. Any other questions? How would you do? I mean, what questions would you ask to ascertain, what the students know prior to? And I'm moving to the next slide, but, we have a few seconds or minutes, to entertain questions. Go back. Any additional questions you would have? Or any comments regarding these?
I think we can, may I say something?
Yes.
I think we can also talk about how language defines or redefines the African identity across the continent.
Okay.
Now that we have so many different languages spoken within
Right.
one national boundaries, political boundaries,
Right.
and how that ties up to the structural dependence of African countries in terms of culture, in terms of technology transfer.
Right.
Those are some of the other questions that I would also
Okay.
maybe talk about.
All right.
If that's okay.
Okay. Anyone else? Soraya?
Well,
And then Robert?
since you give them these questions
Uh-huh.
to think about for the next class, when before class you ask students these questions,
Yeah, like tomorrow.
another one would be, depending on their level of ability to answer these questions accurately or not, they should reflect upon why do they think, if it was the case that they knew little
Right.
about Africa, why do they
Yeah.
think that
Right.
it is the case?
Uh-huh.
And where would this void
Right.
be coming from?
Okay, very good. Robert?
I would ask them how and why is Africa central to the world economy?
Okay. All right. Okay. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I think that what I do is I try to ask him, where did they get the conception of Africa? Is that a Western construction?
Okay.
Okay?
Right.
And then critique, and I asked them, what have you learned about Africa before? And how has that changed after you've taken ADW?
Right.
Right? And I think somebody said it in the other meeting in terms of the contradiction. I think it was, looking at the contradictions between what you knew before and now that you have taken ADW. I think that whole dialectic, and it makes them critically think. And also I try to make a point that why ADW decides to begin the second part of the semester with the scramble of Africa.
Okay.
Okay?
Right. Okay, excellent. And I forgot, I just realized it, but the first question is like, how many states, how many states are there in Africa? Because, the usual mistake is, think of Africa as one, country or one state. So, can we come up with the number? Now, in terms of in class, okay, because again, this was the introduction to the text, and the documentary. So getting into now, I'm connecting this to the text. looking at the first question, how much is the current design of Africa, you know, the construction of states, the drawing of borders, etc., a function of what happened at the Berlin Conference, okay? Is or was the outcome only geographical, okay? Or what other impact or impacts did it have? How do you explain that's another question. They learned that the U.S. was present at the conference, right? So my question is, after, you know, the states didn't claim any, you know, African state, but why was they at the conference? And the fact that they didn't claim, does that, you know, absolve them from being complicit with what was going on? And then, you know, the last one, again, tying, you know, so looking at all the material that is presented, you know, to what extent does, you know, Shoni Barry's career as an artist, you know, his origin, his work in the country where he resides and works, and the reception of the work in the West, how does that exemplify what happened in Berlin? Any comments or, I don't know, suggestions?
And number 4, I think this whole idea that the way that we think of Africa is how the Europeans wanted us to learn about Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And the arrogance from the Europeans to think that only they can define Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And that, you know, to keep us in a way that Africa is backwards, is savage, and we only came in to develop them. And it's only us that could teach you what Africa is. You know, and I think in the article with the aesthetics, that's what he's saying. I have to be an African in the conception of the European, not African coming in from the indigenous people saying this is what I am, which I might be a Yoruba, I might not say that I'm African, right? I have to do with my ethnic background more than this totality of what an African is.
Right.
So the invention of the concept of Africa, that's what I try to do.
Okay. And this also ties into Du Bois, you know, the title of you know, the piece, the shadow, this notion of shadow. How does, you know, Shoni Barry, how does this, you know, lived reality exemplify that, right?
There are also, I just wanted to make a comment about the picture itself, the painting itself.
Yeah.
To look at it and to also make these cross references to other artworks and maybe throw light on the constructions of race and constructions of this object, you know, the objectification of humans.
Right.
So I was very intrigued by the fact that one of the questions asked is to make the link to Oscar Wilde's, you know, book, The Picture of Dorian Gray.
Yeah, right.
I think that kind of made me think more deeply about the interconnections that our students can make. Maybe they haven't read the book, maybe they have, to throw light on how art is not stagnant, neither is literature or any of these disciplines, that we have to make those interconnections.
Right, which brings us into the, you know, some suggested activities, you know, and again, bringing it home to them in terms of, you know, how the United States came about. Okay, this notion of taxation without representation, because in the first text it says that the Africans, but, you know, none of them there were no Africans at the conference. So, and we know what happened, you know, we here, you know, they said, well, since we're not represented, we're going to separate from from England, right? So using that, you know, and they use the Declaration of Independence, you know, to explain, to state, you know, their grievances and the rationale. So here's the, you know, the activity assignment for the students. How would you support or counter a move similar to that of the colonists on the part of the Africans? Since we were not invited to that conference, we reject, you know, this notion of you partitioning. So, and I'm asking them, you know, to draft a document that states, you know, their so those who are for or against, so based on, you know, where you stand, draft, you know, an argument and that you present in class. So that's a possible, you know, activity. And the other one, you know, is the art now, the visual aspect of it. So connecting Schöneberger's, piece to King Leopold's Ghost. How do you put these two in conversation? Comments? Question? Yes.
And this is just a thought about popular culture.
Mhm.
It's timely. Talking about like the invention of Africa and what Africa is.
Right.
First of all, you always have like Coming to America and this
Mhm.
creationism movement.
Mhm.
And then we got Wakanda.
Right.
Panther coming out. Though I want to see the movie.
Yeah, right.
But and how that's like a phenomenon
Mhm.
that people are attaching a lot of representation to, and there are a lot of discussions about, oh, now it's cool to be African.
Right.
This is what we're going to wear, which really goes into the Shonbara's
Mhm.
conversation about cloth and
Right.
manufacturing of
Uh-huh.
African fabric.
Right, yes. Councilor, I don't know if you want to add? Okay,
Well,
so right?
I'm just thinking, as we bring things home, meaning right here at Spelman, and given that any given year we have a certain number of students from Africa.
Right.
And on the one hand, there is this celebration of Africa, maybe through certain aspects of Friday market, the
Mhm.
Friday market,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
And things that are said to be coming from Africa, which actually do come from Africa.
Mhm.
And on the other hand, the feeling of disenfranchisement
Right.
by many international students and specifically the students from Africa,
Mhm.
and a sort of dismissal that they feel that here.
Mhm.
And then the letter that came out a few years ago
Right.
that was so
Yeah.
against
Mhm.
the international students,
Mhm.
and perhaps especially the students from Africa,
Right.
as being students who come and get the scholarships that otherwise are
Mhm.
assumed to be owed
Mhm.
to the African American
I'm going
students.
to explain that later.
Yeah.
because I don't know. That's what we are teaching.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
You remember?
Uh-huh.
A letter was
During,
sent to
let me say,
non-letter.
during the faculty meeting, when all the faculty was in the meeting, at that moment, during that hour, a letter was hand delivered to every, just about every faculty member's office, and was sent out, and after the meeting, everybody, so that horrible letter, that was written by several, I think it was Spelman students, and Dr. Spence at the time, what is her first name?
Cynthia.
Dr. Cynthia, what am I saying? Dr. Cynthia Spence wrote a magnificent response to that letter, but the letter really put to the forefront the dismissal, the disrespect, the misunderstanding, the sense that ownership as an African American person in this institution over others who don't have the same equal rights to what happens in this institution.
Mhm.
I still have a copy somewhere of that letter, but Dr. Spence wrote a beautiful response talking about the beloved community as the world
Mhm.
community.
Mhm.
But so I think it's important to stick to the text
Mhm.
and examine the
Right.
text in depth. But it's also important for students to understand that it's not like Africa over there and African people somewhere, outside the gates of Spelman, is that we got
Mhm,
people
mhm,
from Africa here.
Right. Right. Okay.
And then to make the difference
Mhm.
between race and ethnicity,
Mhm.
because some students confuse that.
Okay.
They use them
Interchangeable. Okay. All right. Okay. So coming now to the after class, what I forgot, I decided, to do this semester more than I did before is to actually, ask the students to talk about, in terms of metacognition, how did you, walk me through how you went into reading, if it's a reading, and viewing, screening, if it's a documentary. Let's talk about, your planning, your pre-planning. Let's talk about, the whole process. Where usually, when you prepare for ADW, you read those texts. Where does it happen? Does it happen in your room? Do you go to the library? Do you go to the the lounge? Do you go to Starbucks? Where does it happen? Tell me. Are you alone? Are there people around you? Is there background noise? All of these things, and then at the end, we get into this. So how did? And again, thank you again to our colleague for really, doing a wonderful job. So this is straight from what she presented last semester. How did the text, work of our video discussions influence your previous understanding of the relationship between Africa and the West? Are there any conceptual thoughts, that you would like to discuss further? What are the primary ADW concepts reflected this week? And do you think so? Especially because I asked the question, the beginning. So now, sort of concluding, do you think that you achieved your learning goals for this week? And yes or no, and if you didn't, what would you change? What would you do? What would you do differently? Comment? Because I have to admit that during the surveys, that's one thing I was not doing consistently. Number 4, that I was not checking on consistently. So this semester I really want to do it, and get the students to, again, be conscious. And in other words, reflect on how they learn. Comments? Questions? Yes.
And this may be an elementary question, but if you ask that question and say, so what is it that you're getting, and then you get crickets, then what's the next step? What do you do to pull it out? And to get the conversation moving about that cognitive process.
I would suggest that they, for the next class period, they either email, post it or, submit something in writing to me.
Okay.
And then, we can meet during my office hours. Or I can respond, comment back on what they, and give them some pointers.
I was just thinking, this would be probably a good opportunity to make a connection between the terms of engagement and the learning goals. Because a lot of the first few weeks are focused on colonialism,
Right.
imperialism,
Right.
development, and so on. So once they put that in the forefront of how they're engaging with the topics,
Okay.
maybe they will be able to articulate their learning goals as well, on a weekly basis.
Right.
I'm just kind of
Okay.
thinking aloud.
All right. Yes.
I also think that's a good idea to think about yesterday, today, and tomorrow. As it relates to the relationship between the continent of Africa and Europe generally, or
Okay.
even other countries around the world too. And that can be tied up to the concept of globalization,
Okay.
imperialism, neo-colonialism.
Right.
And maybe reconstruct and redefine what neo-colonialism looks like. Because what we believed yesterday, what neo-colonialism used to be or was, is not the same kind of neo-colonialism now. And so we need to reflect on the past and think about the present and the future too.
Okay.
Just to kind of trigger their thinking process about
Right.
what has worked, didn't work, why the condition of the Africa is the way it is now, and how can we move forward.
Okay. Good point.
Against huge forces such as globalization, that's what you are saying, right? Against these huge movements, like globalization. I like in your previous slide, you don't need to return to it.
Okay.
I like this thing about Africa and the West, because the same way we try to help students understand that you cannot have this totality Africa. There are languages, there are ethnic groups, there are borders which don't make sense. And when we say the West, how would they feel if somebody was the West? You know, there are languages within the West. There are different countries and cultures and habits and uniqueness and diversity, and the same applies to Africa. Also, this idea of in the relationship, I was an evaluator in one of our colleagues' class, teaching ADW, and I thought the professor did an excellent job with the map of Africa with the map of the West. And there was some hands, but it was not Africa with the hands wanting something. It was the West taking the resources. It was just an image, but it spoke very clearly to the students that the West has enriched himself on the back of actual people and resources from Africa. And so I think an imagery sometimes helps to send a message.
Which I usually do use, images and sounds and so forth and so on. So, but that's a great transition segue into week 3, and then I'll leave 4 and 5 for you. Perspective from the diaspora and colonialism in Africa, and these would be my questions to sort of check what the students know or don't know, and I sort of the first one concentrate on Du Bois and tell them that as a student grad student and then later on as a scholar, Du Bois traveled the world, and how many do you know some of the countries that outside of the United States, of course, that Du Bois visited, and even taking this one step further, at some point in his life, number 2, he was dissatisfied with the situation here, and he renounced his U.S. citizenship and moved permanently with his wife to an African state, where he died. Do you know which one? Right? And also now bringing Rodney into the conversation. And again, I'm always thinking with a map. Can you place Guyana on a map? Are you familiar with Rodney's activism at the local, national, and international level? Some questions. So I don't know if you have others. Yes.
Do you talk about Walter Rodney's legacy in the AUC at all? In relation to Atlanta?
I didn't think about that. Oh, that's a very good. No.
I didn't know about it until our father mentioned it. He went to ITC.
Okay.
And when I looked it up, the Walter Rodney Foundation is here.
Okay.
In the city of Atlanta. And so I don't know much about it, but because it's so close.
Wow. Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you for mentioning that. Yes.
Well, I think on the development, I take an opportunity to teach about that.
What, Du Bois or Rodney?
Walter Rodney, and this whole, to kind of continue to reinforce the idea that when they constructed the image of Africa, they used these dichotomies, savage, not savage, developed under development, and that how our brains or our thoughts or our perceptions of Africa the construction of knowledge of Africa, how it's been constructed the way we think about it, it has to do with either poor, rich, backwards, forwards, all the time in dichotomies, and that Walter Rodney brings to fore the idea that the reason that Africa, the word that they invented under development, has to do with the fact of colonialism and imperialism, and the fact that they have taken all their resources in order to industrialize Europe and kind of bring back this whole thing of expanding the idea of colonialism and imperialism and development, and critiquing the whole concept of development. And who and kind of the ironic thing is to show that when Africa was developed, you just read the last semester, from the other kingdoms, Sahara, and they erase all that. And they begin their history the way that we are taught. Begins with slavery. or the scramble of Africa, right?
Right.
And it eliminates all that other parts that shows Africa as kingdom, as very well developed, way before the Europeans. Okay, African had all these resources, so so for them to kind of understand of how we've been brainwashed. So we don't want to be Africans because we always associate Africa with underdevelopment, right? So when you get a high school kid and you tell them, "Oh, you African American," they say, "I'm not African American. What are you talking about? What are you talking about? That's underdevelopment, you know? I'm an American, you know, which means progress. It means development. It means, you know, all these good things that that is not true because we live in communities that are underdeveloped, right? Right. And for them to understand, I think Walter Rodney, I'm going too long, okay? Walter Rodney teaches us how the underdevelopment takes place, okay? And it's a good way to show with the class struggle, with the last reading that we did, or that was in the other class, okay? In terms of the effects of colonialism, so a lot of communities in the U.S. take that model of development and underdevelopment, and then you could apply all these concepts to our own lives, right? Like, you know, the West End, okay? The West End, or you know, all these black communities that were developed in the 30s and the 50s. It was the classical case of urbanism and urban life, right? Harlem is the best example, okay? Lost, okay? Now Harlem belongs to the upper middle class, okay? And so everything that Harlem gave to the development of a national culture is taken away, right? And the only thing that people remember is unless the Europeans moved to Harlem, Harlem would have died. Right? I don't know. So I'm talking, you know, I try to teach them the complexity. This is nothing clear because I think that when we are colonized, our mind is not clear to think of these things clearly. And so we don't see it when we have these things of oppression and exploitation right in front of our nose. Okay? We think about them. And what I wanted to say is that also the concept of the other is started with this whole thing of the partition of Africa. Okay?
Right.
And so this is an opportunity for them to start thinking of this concept of how they construct the other. And how Africa became the example of we're the civilized and you are the other. Right? And then it's generalized to everybody that's colonized. So kind of advancing them to the key concepts like the other, like the West, like the construction of Africa. It's an invention, okay? Because you know this was constructed at a particular point for the benefit of the Europeans. It's the conception of constructing Africa, and we take it as the right way.
Okay, Soraya, you had
I had a continuation of what Dr. Morales was saying, which is that as we bring the students to think more critically with consciousness about the terms that we use, and you mentioned developing and so on, there's the term aid, right? When we say we're aiding Africa who needs, who begs, who's waiting to receive, and with the fact that Europe is who was poor, Africa was rich, Europe went and stole, and took advantage of, and so this so-called aid can be looked at as a form of what should be reparation, and more to come. So I think the same colleague that I mentioned earlier that I sat in the class of mentioned the flip coin, the imagery of the flip coin. So developed and was developed, but then you can just say Africa was the developed one. These are the thieves that came and took, and so on. And aid is a form of reparation. So it's it brings us back to firm conscientization and thinking critically about the terms. And hopefully the United States is still developing.
So
I was wondering about aid because aid could also be a way, it's never just handed.
Mhm.
There are always strings attached to foreign aid, you know, so this aid that might seem as reparation or some sort of like payment for what was taken,
Mhm.
just comes as another way of continuing the dependency.
Right,
Mhm.
right.
Mhm.
Um,
Because of the debt.
Right.
From Western countries.
Right. So it's, you know, these questions, you know, are just, again, a way to put, you know, this week's, you know, documents in conversation with the ones, you know, from the previous week, you know, Du Bois, you know, the Shonibari dialogue, and also the piece on the scrambling for Africa. So again, and also Rodney, you know, tying Rodney and Du Bois. So, maybe let me just go to the some more questions here to the activities, and then I'll you know, turn it to across the room. So what I'm doing here is, you know, bringing it home to the students. We talk about, you know, development and underdevelopment, and explain how we, you know, I mean, this is what, 2018, we played this dialogue, or whatever you choose to call it, between Africa and the West. We here in the United States, we are at the heart of it. Okay, so when, you know, have you put any thought into, you know, when you go to Starbucks, you know, and buy your macchiato or whatever it is, your gourmet, you know, hot beverage, the impact, you know, how you are playing a role into, you know, helping develop or underdevelop. So that's sort of what I'm asking them to, you know, to do here. Think of, you know, last time I checked, there's no coffee. We don't grow coffee in America. So where's the coffee? I mean, grown, and, you know, how much does your, you know, your favorite beverage cost? Now put that in conversation with, you know, how much you think Starbucks paid, you know, the African, you know, coffee grower, and what are some of the steps? You know, same thing. Most of us drive cars. You know, where does, you know, the raw material come from? Oh yeah, and Carlton, talk about it too. You know, all of us have, you know, smartphones, not to mention iPhones. Yeah.
You're really talking about the usurpation
Right.
of terms, because Starbucks, on the other hand, will tell you, but we're going with fair trade.
Yeah.
Right.
We're paying them more.
Yeah.
Well, you know, than they would otherwise get. So,
Right.
so it's the usurpation of,
Mhm.
terms,
Right.
such as fair
Yeah.
trade,
Right.
which is part
Yeah.
of the scenario
Right.
that is profit.
Right.
And, to use that to follow with the example, the commodification of guilt,
Mhm.
Starbucks
Right.
uses a little bit of what you pay to
Right. Right.
invest that money into,
Yeah.
so you not
Right.
just are consuming,
Right.
but you're also feeling good about consuming.
Right.
Without, you know,
Yeah.
like
Right.
splitting this two.
Right. So again, so the idea is to have them do some research, you know, in terms of some of those, you know, raw materials coming from Africa that we, you know, import, and, you know, look at, you know, once they're turned into, you know, manufactured goods, and some of them sold, you know, to Africa, you know, how does it compare? I mean, what obtains, you know, from that trade, and you know, and also thinking in terms of labor, you know, laws in the U.S. and Africa. You know, how much? In other words, the question is how much did it cost Africa, or, you know, Kenyan, you know, coffee grower for me to enjoy my you know, beverage, and is there anything that could be done, you know, to change that, you know, dialogue and
Or, as Dr. Waldemariam told us,
yeah.
to think in terms of the future.
Right.
And
Yeah.
look at China's role in Africa today, which is something that they might be a little bit more familiar with,
Yeah.
and send them to articles and chapters in the book
Right.
of Dr.
Yeah.
Waldemariam.
That's your book,
Yeah. Yeah, very good point. Yeah, so in terms of, like, you know, as consumers, you know, and activism, if you can call it that. So what is it, you know, what power do we have as consumers, you know, to influence things?
I just was thinking, you know, while guilt is a facade in some senses for the
Right.
corporate world to make good what later,
Uh-huh.
we should also be strategic to use and
Mhm.
subvert
Mm-hmm.
the extraction of resources from Africa.
Right.
If it means use guilt, if
Right.
possible, that is one way to get back the
Right,
resources.
right.
If possible.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that while guilt is a weak point among the liberal, Westerners, we should use it. I don't think we should say, oh, this won't do enough. I know it won't do enough, but if you don't use it, you're going to get that extreme, like the Trump kind of people who
Right.
have no guilt,
Right.
And I think that's a response to that guilt.
Yeah.
We don't want to feel anything of the,
Yeah, of course, I mean, if I used to ask this question, and I said, I ask myself every day, do I live a life ethically that I'm free from the instruments of colonization? And I can't really truthfully say I'm free from it, because we have to live our lives, daily lives, and do go to Starbucks sometimes, and do go to,
Sure.
and I have to buy some things, and I don't always read if it's fair trade, and yeah, I mean, I'm guilty of some of that, but we also need to be aware that that doesn't mean we are simply, submitting to this system, that we have no voice to critique it. I think we should become aware and really point out there.
And the last image you had, Dr. Pierre,
Yes.
with the advertisement about the sweatshirt,
Right.
with the young black,
Right.
okay.
Yeah.
There's a response.
Yeah,
by
yeah,
the-
yeah,
Excellent
yeah, I forgot to add
Which
this up,
is,
but
I'm
yeah.
not angry,
Right.
I'm disappointed.
Yeah.
And I'm disappointed because you, black folk in the diaspora, will continue to go buy the Tommy Hill, buy the brands, buy this. So there's something about being outraged and enraged and
Right.
mad and angry, but there's something more potentially productive about being disappointed
Right.
and saying, but let's look at how we might participate
Right.
in the construction of that which you
Right.
criticize in this
Okay.
advertisement.
Right.
And how many of our youth buy clothes from H&M?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not as if we can be free, but we can be conscious.
Right.
about what-
Yeah.
Yeah, we can be. Yeah.
Right.
Those who have no money have no choice. Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
With with Walmart,
Right.
the prices are so
Mhm.
inexpensive,
Right.
and for a lot of disadvantaged people who just have to be, people of color. That is, that's the only store that they can go to, so like me here, one of my good friends was like, I don't shop at Walmart, I shop at Target. And it wasn't, a lot of our friends thought because she was, bougie. But no, I know their policies, and she was in her about that position, that she had that option, and most people don't have that option. But I thought it was interesting that the response to the H&M sweater, that
Yeah.
they closed a lot of stores in South Africa, because they
All of the
just,
stores.
they just ran that stuff. So that's kind of interesting. Listen,
Mama told us that our ex-guests know about that. That little boy's mom.
right,
It was a trip.
she was offended. Like, it's not a big deal, calm down.
No, you calm down.
Okay, so,
I
But
got
see-
my check.
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I think we will not stop talking.
About the little boy's mother that you mentioned. Now, there might be some fact, I don't know what the financial situation of that particular family is and whatever monetary benefits they got from it. But there's this thing about being in the place of need and receiving donations. And Spelman doesn't have clean hands necessarily about the money that we accept. And some of it is anonymous, but once sometimes it is revealed who is behind. And so what do you do when you're in a position of need? And where it matters, because it's a scholarship for a student who may be able to finish the degree, but the money from where that comes from is tainted.
Well, it looks like I don't really have a whole lot of things to add to what Alex has already talked about, but there are a couple of points that that I would want to consider talking about in a classroom, ADW 112. And one of them is God, gold, and glory. And that is really a representation quite often used among African scholars as a brief, short description that captures the relationship between Africa and European countries and the colonization and the scramble for Africa that has taken place in 1884, 1885. So those are some concepts. I don't really have any questions to ask, but these are the concepts that I will talk about. How does God get into the discussion about colonialism? And what does glory mean from the point of view of the colonialist, European colonial powers? And what does the gold represent in the scramble for Africa? These are some of the big ideas, I think, that can help us understand and explore and maybe explain the past and the future as it relates to the relationship between Africa and European countries. So I'm going to be moving on to the chapter by Walter Rodney, which I was supposed to be talking about, and I know Alex has covered a lot of it. But let me just skip to it and then talk about some of the concepts. Throughout the chapter, you see that there is a discussion about development and underdevelopment. So, if we're going to be understanding what underdevelopment is, then we have to understand what development is. I don't think anybody will be able to understand what underdevelopment looks like without understanding what development is. So how do we define development? That's one question that anybody can, the professor and one of you can throw to the students and ask them what their understanding of what development is. And I ask you the same question too, by way of contributing to the discussion on development. Can anyone tell me what development is?
I'm cheating because I got this from an economist. Last meeting we had, Bernie Scott explained to us what from economic terms they mean by growth versus development, or growth and development. Mm-hmm. So I guess she was saying growth is often seen is measured by GDP, but development does not necessarily have to be. While World Trade Organization's, ideas about development agenda may be conforming to making the developing countries attain the level of development that is considered, or measured by GDP. There is another way, and I think she mentioned one of the countries, Tanzania, as having reached the goal of development without necessarily having reached the goal of growth.
Yeah.
So even if they did not achieve the GDP, they made sure that their resources were turned to health, improving health, education, all those necessities of life for the majority of the people in their country. And that is really true development. There are, other forms of development.
True. I think there is a misinterpretation, misdefinition of what development is. Even among economists, we used to define what development is by the extent to which a country's economy grows. And so we say sustainable growth. But there is no such thing as sustainable growth. There can only be sustainable development that for us to understand what sustainable development is, we may also compare and contrast at a particular time, for a particular country, what the economic growth rate might be, but not the sustainability of the growth. So I think the point that I'm trying to make here, maybe to share with all of you, is we have to make clear what the concepts are. If we're going to ask students to understand the African condition, the relationship between Africa and Europe, then each one of the terminologies must be clearly defined and understood. Without it, we are losing them. Sorry?
Right, I agree, but we need to do so very cautiously as we define the terms, because if we decide to embrace the terminology developing, underdeveloped, developing is always going to be to the detriment of underdeveloped. And so it's a way of thinking that is organizing societies and nations in hierarchical terms, developed in relation to how a particular nation understands development. Now, in another circumstance of colonialism, and I'm thinking about the French in Algeria, if a colonized Algerian embraced French language and became good at manipulating French language, that person was said to have chosen the path of, and this was the language, modernity, the developing world, and was rewarded with certain positions where there might be a watch person in a neighborhood to try to keep things calm when the revolution is under boiling. So in that sense, how it can be used as a reward if you are deemed to be developed or on the path to development, to the detriment of the African languages, or in this case of Arabic, because it was forbidden to speak Arabic, you had to speak French at all times. So it put it in, again, hierarchical terms. One, French language, supposed to be the one of modernity, the one of the developed world, as opposed to the native languages that are deemed to be inferior. And Gumi Wationgo talks about that in the one Decolonizing the Mind, where he says that if a child was caught playing in Kikuyu, the child was punished and had to wear a plaque, I am a donkey. And the French, of course, we had to go to the French teacher and receive the physical punishment because we were caught during recess, mind you, playing in Arabic as opposed to playing in French. So it's beyond economics, this question of development, underdevelopment.
Absolutely.
It's about language, it's about rewards, it's about...
I think that...
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Should I finish?
Yes, sir.
Okay. The context, well, just a thought about the context for development. I think you have to deal with it based on material development, and then there's a spiritual development. Within the context of an African reality, there's always that didactic, there's difference, there's countries that are very material, industrialized, etc. development, but spiritually bankrupt, i.e., the one we live in so many ways. But it doesn't mean that everybody in there is bankrupt. And so as we start to deal with that concept of development, we certainly should incorporate in our terminology the differences between a materially developed reality and a spiritually developed reality. Meaning that within that spiritual development, it can be subsumed with the cultural ideas, which was traditional in that particular landmass, language, religious practice. And I always think about, well, what was the religious practice before Christianity, before Islam? And I'm Muslim, but there's something existed before then. And so as we begin to look at development, we have to begin to address those kinds of things.
Absolutely. In fact, there was, he is now the prime minister of one of the small countries in northwestern part of Asia. I think somewhere around China. He was a graduate of Columbia University and went back to become the prime minister of that country. I'm sorry, I forgot the name of the country. But he came up with the idea of defining development. He said it's really not about economics alone. It's not about political development alone. It's not about social development alone. It's the totality of development. And the term that he used was gross national happiness. You know, gross domestic product as opposed to gross domestic product. He wanted to use development to define development in terms of gross national happiness. And so people become happy in so many different kinds of achievements. You know, spiritually inspired, materially they have acquired and succeeded and exceeded the expectations of themselves and by others. And so the totality of it is really what development is. Now, if you look at that, then you say, well, in that case, the United States is really not a developed country because of some of the ideas that you may bring up in your discussion.
And unhappy people.
Probably the most unhappy
Yes,
people
that's what the
among
studies-
all Western European or industrialized countries.
I'm sorry, my question is answered, thank you.
Okay.
I just had a question about if anybody can remember who's the economist who won the Nobel Prize just recently, anybody who can remember? He did come up with this theory which negated this idea of individualistic progress as a sign of happiness. He said it is those who actually work in communities and give a kind of spread happiness.
Mhm.
That's one way that you can think in terms of development and underdevelopment, because the terms are definitely based on a Western idea of progress,
Mhm.
modernity, as you put it. So to undermine that, I think I also want to say that the Westerners have questioned these practices and ideologies of what we assign as Western. They themselves have critiqued it, and it's important for us to highlight those Westerners who don't buy into their own, this what I think, construction of the superiority of the West.
Good point. Yeah. Okay. So, but let me just make a couple of points about how Rodney defines what development is, and he looks at it from the gross national income per capita. That even, he says, is a distortion about how resources are distributed. Simply because a country's gross national income happens to be, say, $5 trillion and divided by the number of people who are residents of that country, then you come up with the gross national income per capita, per individual. But you look at my wallet, I don't even have a dime. And while other people have millions and millions of dollars, stashed around in so many different banks, some of them in the Caribbean and some of them in Zurich, Swiss, and you know what I'm talking about. So, and so that, the definition of development by the gross national income is misleading. So I guess for us to talk about in the class to our students, we just have to make sure that they understand and critically examine what development is, and how you can come up with a qualitative and quantitative measurement of development.
Yeah, I wanted to share with all of you an interesting thing that I saw on the news. Somehow, the French government has decided to return some of the art pieces that belong to the Congo. Beautiful pieces that it shows, you know, the civilization of the Congo was tremendous. The argument for not wanting to return these beautiful pieces is because they don't have the right places to put and to preserve this art. They're not developed enough. Their museums don't have the right climate, and you know, and they don't have the right cases. And in other words, they're not, the pieces will disintegrate if they go back to the original people, okay? And they're saying, we're just gonna miss so much money if we return these art pieces to the African people because they just don't know how to take care of it. Now, the interesting thing in here for me was, as I was hearing this in the news, is the construction of primitive art. Okay, and how they've made that into an art form, which were the religious objects of traditional people, becomes the primitive art that influences all Western art, Picasso and all of that, right? But they're not entitled of their own things that they've created because their level is not ready for that kind of classical art piece. It should not be in Africa that is underdeveloped. So we're doing something that now belongs not to that particular group of people, but to the world. And for the interest of the world art, we need to keep it in France. Because that way everybody can see it. And so I thought that I would bring this to the students for them to critically think about this. Because not even when we produce great pieces of art, in this issue of development has entitled even to the spirituality, because art I associated with spirituality. So they're taking not only your raw resources, but what you give to the world, what Africa gave to the world, this whole aesthetic, okay? Using the argument that you're inferior, basically. It's the same. The argument is always reduced to the same. Africa is inferior. It's simply, no matter how you put it, that's where it ends up. You're not, you know. And I think that you know, if this is a model and they spread that to the world, not only to Africa, you know, they spread to the world that we're not even prepared or equipped to protect our own culture. So it has to be taken away from us and put it in another place for the people that have the knowledge to preserve it. We don't have the equipment. We cannot preserve our own survival. You know? And so that's, you know, what I call painful anthropology. Okay? Because there's no solution, and you have to tell the truth of how any way that we try to defend ourselves, we end up at the bottom. Okay?
Any comment? Any addition?
I'm just gonna try to respond to what you were saying. But it got me thinking about a comment that I had heard once about a music form that was from like the hills of Mississippi, and Alan Lomax, you know, recorded it and put it away in the Smithsonian somewhere for years and years, and his daughter was like, okay, now I'm gonna give it back to the people of Mississippi, but they don't want to listen to it. They don't think it's appropriate. And how like the underdevelopment extends to culture. I think that's what you were saying.
Yeah.
Because of the fact that you take the materials in the first place, put them somewhere they don't belong, where they're away from their original context, and then you create a situation where the people who produced it are coerced or forced to not to accept it. And then when you want to be paternalistic and give it back, then it's just like, well, they don't want it. We tried. So that's what I thought.
Like black people don't listen to jazz.
And
right?
what is also interesting is that while you have all this art, you know, in the West, you know, at home to you, Westerners, is that you fail to, you know, to abide to your own rules because you would not provide any information regarding provenance, of the art piece, how it was obtained, which is in the art word, that's, you don't do that. That's unprofessional. You cannot have art on display and not say who painted it or who photographed it and how you obtained it. But that's what you do with the African art that you have on display, you know, in France and so many other, you know, so it's really interesting.
Okay, so earlier, I think we were talking about how aid is, I think, used as instruments of exploitation or to lift, you know, the development of the African countries, to help them finance their development projects. And so the structural dependence of the African countries is really promoted through any one of these and maybe more, you know. The political neocolonialism generally includes the indirect control of the African resources, indirect control through, you know, remote controls of the African elites, who I call modernizing. They are not really modern, but they are modernizing, aspiring to modernize, who have adapted the European culture to exploit their own people, and Rodney talks about that. And I also think, personally, I'm one of those people who I believe that we need to reflect on our history. But there has to be a time where we have to move on and maybe learn a lesson from the history in order to deal with the contemporary challenges of the African countries and contemporary challenges that afflicts the African diaspora. And so earlier too, I think there was a discussion about, I don't know, maybe some of you know that I have migrated from one country to another. So when people talk about, you know, issues of immigration, I know what that means. I have lived in Sudan. They speak Arabic. It's a completely different culture, but I had to adapt to that culture. And then moved on to Egypt, and then came to the United States. Along the way, I have heard some things about, you know, Caucasians and African Americans in the United States. And so my understanding of the different groups within the United States is really informed by my experience throughout the journey. I say that simply because when we are referring to the condition of the African countries present day, let's also not forget about the challenges that we have to overcome between black people in the United States and black people in the diaspora. There are seriously some issues that we have to tackle, some issues that we have to talk about openly, because when we say race is really at the core of the problem, well, maybe so, if we are looking at our condition from the perspective of the relationship between blacks and whites. But we also have issues of multiple identities, loyalties within the African American, within the black diaspora itself. And to talk about Pan-Africanism without resolving all of these issues seems to be a little bit idealist. So it may be a good idea to just pose the question to the students. You know, how do we relate with one another? Do we really identify with one another as, you know, people of black races who are confronted with the same challenges, with the same issues, pitted against one another in many cases? So these are some of the things that we can have students to think about, to reflect, you know, to identify and define who they are. So trade, investment, loan, and aid. You know, everybody knows, and I'm suspecting that students know too, that Africa, the continent of Africa, is the richest country, the richest not country, but the continent compared to any other continent in the world. We've got the resources, we've got the human capital, but in terms of how, regardless of how you define development, particularly with the economic aspect of it, Africa happens to be economically underdeveloped, but developed in other areas, maybe. But so how did that happen? Well, one of them is trade, and the other one is investment. In a chapter that I have just published about a year ago, there is one section, I think it's entitled Primitive Trade. And in the primitive trade, I talk about, it's really not about whether trade is good or bad, whether trade is the engine of growth or not. It is. Countries that do trade tend to grow economically, no doubt about it. But within it, what really makes a difference is what you trade. And so if you are exchanging goods, primary goods for manufactured goods, without considering the terms of exchange, then the economic situation in those countries and generally around the African continent might continue to be underdeveloped. So it's not about trade. People talk about, is trade good or bad? Fair trade, good trade, bad trade. I think at the core of the problem with regard to development and underdevelopment is about what is being traded. Back about centuries ago, about 400, 500 years ago, the African middlemen who exchanged their own brothers, their own sisters, for ornaments and guns and machetes and so on. And European explorers, European slave traders intentionally kept the exchange to be unfavorable to the Africans and favorable to the Europeans. So the idea of unequal terms of trade, the concept of it didn't start yesterday, right after Andre Gernot Frank wrote about it. In practice, that has been the case for centuries. And Europeans exchanged the most valuable capital, including human capital, from the African countries to the most rudimentary instruments. And I call them, part of it is means of production, exchanged for means of destruction. And so the means of production are the African human resources, natural resources, exchanged for the means of destruction. Those are the machines and the bullets and the tanks and everything else. What happened yesterday still happens today.
And the ideology.
The ideology.
And I think this is important to make me think of what you're saying, of how African Americans lost the West. The West End, when I moved to Atlanta, was the center of cultural development. In terms of leading up to central theories, in terms of, artists mainly, okay? And that was something that I assumed that was going to be there forever. There was no way that they were going to take the West End away from black people. I just thought they were so grounded. And what I'm seeing now is that there's no place that people need money, I'll give you money, trade your house, okay? And people are saying, oh, what a great opportunity, I can get this money, right? I can sell my house, when they already know that the trade is unequal, that what they're going to be able to resell the house in the West End is something that they could never imagine. They could send all of their kids to college, okay? but because they need it, and it's happening all over Atlanta, it's happening, everywhere. What do they call that, gentrification, right?
Gentrification, yeah.
Which is another example, an urban example of what happens to poor people, and usually they're Latinos, in this case, African Americans. But it's unequal because your house is worth so much, and they know that, and they could get it, and they wait. I think it happened to Morris Brown. I remember, I think I forgot, the guy who used to run the rich guy from the said, I forgot, he used to NCA, one of this program, one of these guys that runs CNN said, no, wait till Morris Brown is completely run down, and then we'll buy it. We're not going to buy it now that their prices are. Let's wait another 10 years. And then we could get all that land, for much cheaper. So somehow they know that plan of unequal development works. And that's how they're able to build capitalism, right? On that. And it's such a good that it happens everywhere. And it's a model that is applied to so many situations of our lives that is really difficult to break through, to be able to get your head out of the war and pay your bills and, build a secure future for your family because you're in debt all the time because of the unequal development. It's like a master plan. You try to get out and somehow they appropriate, whether it be culture, they appropriate the culture. You invent a cultural symphony and opera and everything that is classical, like jazz, that nobody can replicate it, and they appropriate it, they change it, and they make it, And so I want to give the students hope because I get depressed, okay? And I want to be able to, and what you're saying is, it's like, okay, well, what do we do? Okay? Because they're the leaders. And if this is a mechanism, okay, what is it that we're teaching them to go beyond survival? To be able to make a contribution to their families and those little kids that are growing up. What skills, is it metacognitive enough? Was our problem a little bit bigger than metacognition? Okay? And that's what I ask myself, and sometimes I don't have, I'm like, what do they call it? A depressed person.
But isn't that also what I would say, think about your thinking in that sense? Metacognition is probably the route to coming out of depression, because we can say, to what extent do I have control over this situation? Right. Some kind of.
Well, the first thing is to get out of being an individual.
Right.
That's our downfall, okay? That we lost our ability to think collectively. So we only think me first, me second, me third. So when we bought that Western model, that was our loss. That was it. That was the only tool that we had to fight capitalism, was the fact that we could pull ourselves in a large group and have, central ideas. It's very difficult to pull one group now, one common idea. And that's what they want, because we can no longer unite around one idea and say, let's put a united front. And that, in building those kind of groupings, you have the individual philosophy emerging, and and the ego and the whole thing, and I think that's the fact that we got away from our African spirituality, where you put the group first. It's not how it's going to benefit me only, but how is my decision going to benefit the group? Okay, and maybe I have to hold back because yes, I might advance, but I'm nobody without the group. Right? And so that's what I try to tell the students, because of the fact that you have to have a balance between, yes, you live in a Western society, so the individual is the God, okay, or the goddess or whatever. But what do you have from your ancestral line that is going to save the society? Well, it's that feeling that you got to do something for the group, not only yourself, but that's.
And that's something we can think about in terms of pedagogy too. If we are constantly rewarding individual effort,
Exactly.
over
Yes.
group
Yes.
effort,
Yes.
we may be
Yes.
conforming to that.
Exactly.
And I'm just thinking about, I know there are different facets to this very complex issue. But there is also this notion that when we teach, how do we, do we expect the answer from an individual, or do we want them to collectively come up with some responses? And how do we build that into our pedagogy? Just throwing that out. That's what.
Okay. I wonder if there is anything else I can contribute. And we have already talked about how language becomes a mechanism of integration and dependence. Globalization, we mentioned it earlier, and these are some of the concepts that students may have already known some things about, but it might be a good idea for us to talk about in depth about how globalization and the extent to which Africa is integrated into the global economy. I mean, we may think that globalization is really a new phenomenon, but it's not. Nations have always traded with one another. There is a long history of trade between, for example, East Africa and Asia, Ethiopia and India. If you happen to be coming to one of our traditional festivals among Ethiopians, and you already have some dishes from Indian restaurant or Indian family, you cannot really distinguish between whether what you are eating is Ethiopian or Indian.
That's true. That's why I go to Ethiopia. That's right.
With East Africa, with Asia, all the way to Central Asia, Southeast Asia, with the exception of some of the islands which happen to be very remote and very difficult to reach too, and I'm talking about Japan. But besides that, globalization, trade, exchange of goods and service has always been defining characteristics of the economies of all nations. The resistance that globalization is not good, I can understand it. But we shouldn't really talk about it as if it was just a recent phenomenon. It wasn't. Someone mentioned earlier in the morning meeting, we talked about all of these, defining and redefining and having students think about colonialism, neo-colonialism, all the big questions and concepts. And then you say, so what? Okay? So what do we do? I think it doesn't have to be at the end of the semester. It can be at any given period of time during the semester for us to say, okay, so we talk about exploitation and exploitative relationship between Africa and European countries, and people mention that Africa and Europe is perhaps as diverse as society can be. There is no homogeneous Europe. Even Japan, I don't believe, is homogeneous. It all depends how you look at, how you categorize and classify society, depending on what you are looking at. And so it may be African countries are diverse, European countries are diverse, and despite the resistance and despite the people in the White House, United States was, is, and will always be a diverse society. Having talked about all of this, then it's saying, so what? What do we do? And we can kind of trigger their thought processes. Metacognition is really about the process, isn't it? And so trigger their thought processes to think about beyond what happened. Now, I think if we spend a great deal of time thinking about the history of it, it might be a disservice to them, to society, and to the world as a whole. And as Marcus Garvey would say in one of the sections that we read for this week from 2 to 5, big ideas have no national boundaries. And as our future leaders of the world, students would have to think in that way. Doesn't matter who they are, but what they think about, the big ideas, are not limited by anything. Okay. So I hope I have contributed just a little bit.
Thank you very much.
To our discussions, and I have taken up much of the time. I think.
No. I think
Well,
you
we-
generated a lot of
Yeah.
discussion, and both of you did a great job. Thank you so
I
much.
happen to be talking about the chapter that
We learn from each other.
Right.
And some
I
things-
noticed that we didn't say anything about
Right.
Césaire, but I mean, I have,
Oh, yes.
absolutely, but
I
I
do.
can send, I mean, I can send.
I have a slide. If we have time,
Yes,
we can talk
send
about
it to you.
Okay.
Right.
Maybe-
Let me see. And I have it. This is what you're talking about, isn't it?
No, there's another, the discourse on
Yeah.
colonialism.
Is that?
No.
Discourse?
Discourse on colonialism.
Okay.
And you can just summarize a thought or idea you may have, or we can fit to that.
Hmm.
Want to say something, Alex?
Oh, maybe one thing that I don't think we've ever talked about that is important to tell to the students is that nowadays, you know, you go to France or the French-speaking world and you talk about discourse and colonialism, and everybody, you know, descended French, you're a descended French person will tell you how great of a writer and speaker Césaire was. But we have to know that this document was it was asked of him, you know, to write from. I think it's Scholarly Review asked Césaire to write something on colonialism, and this is, you know, this was a right-wing leaning review. I mean, journal, sorry, who was hoping that it would write something favorable to, you know, colonialism, and we know what happened. So as a result, you know, the media, you know, really praised, you know, they recognized how great of a speaker, I mean, a writer he was, and someone mentioned, okay, because it's not a discourse. In other words, it was not, Césaire never stood in front of a crowd and read it. It's a book. But, so the media praised, you know, the book, but the members of the government, you know, leaning, they criticized Césaire. They said that he was a traitor. And he was banned, you know, from a political standpoint. And when Césaire died years ago, the then, you know, president, you know, because, you know, by the time, like I said, everybody was aware of how, you know, there's never been any, you know, such a writer, and not just a writer, but also a poet, because he was mayor of the capital city in Martinique for so many years. So the question became, you know, what kind of, you know, what should we do, you know, for the passing of this man, you know, because it goes beyond the island. So should we offer, you know, a national ceremony? And someone mentioned, well, should it be? Well, he should be buried in France, where all the great, you know, state persons, you know, are buried. And then the islanders said, wait a minute, no, he's Martinican, you know, we're not going to give his body to you. And somebody had to remind, you know, Martinique, and we had to remind French people, oh, now you're praising Césaire, but remember, when this came out, he was not, you know, so, he was not viewed as you know, the great man that you having him to be now. So I think it's important to mention that because this was controversial. Remember, he would ask, he was expected to write something favorable, and he did the exact opposite. So I think it's worth mentioning,
We need another Césaire to respond to that. The guy who wrote about the case for colonialism. We need another Césaire, right?
Right. And I'll leave it at that. But that's really interesting what you're saying, because again, you look at the book was published in 1950, right? But as recently, so colonialism is controversial in France. It would be anywhere. So you have different heads, of states who got as late as 2005 who went to Africa and said to the Senegalese to their face that slavery and colonialism was not a bad thing. That and Sarkozy. So he also said that the current generation of French should not be held responsible for what their ancestors did, and not and this is really related to Rodney here, not all the evils or the problems that Africa is running into now could not and should not be attributed to slavery and colonialism. 2005, as late as 2000, or as recent, as 2005.
This is when it ties into what was said earlier, Dr. Morales, Dr. Waldemariam, and at least when the I balances itself vis-à-vis the we, the need of the individual and the need of the community. And I'm saying that because in one of his plays, Césaire says, in every humiliated man, in every man who is lynched, in every man who is poor, and he goes on like this with the very strong global transnational realities, I see myself lynched, poor, abused. So, in other words, at which point, and you finished with this question to the students, right? So what? So now, what do we do? And the question is, one may live, as our students do, in a society which privileges the individual, whereby the individual needs become the center of one's actions and so on. And you look at the needs of the community and which one are you going to be putting first when they conflict. And one of the issues, I will give you this example. I was invited at the State Department to do it 3 years ago to give a talk about Algeria and its previous colonies, its relationship. And I did something along the accusations of Césaire, right? And at the end, there were lots of people in the audience. A woman of all places from Algeria, where I'm from, stood up in front of all these Pentagon people and said, well, I am happy as an Algerian that the French were there for 132 years. And let me tell you what. My family, we are from the Atlas Mountains. And it used to take hours just to go to school. And when the French built that road, thanks to France, I got to be able to go to school. It was ridiculous. It was a catastrophe. And so what I'm saying is, the students, they do need to think about what next, or what I student, whatever my name is, see myself. You know, Spelman mission says to change the world. I mean, what about the aspect of arrogance that is in there, right? To change the world. Who? You know. So, what does it mean to you to change the world, and what communities are you talking about? And at which point do you, Spelman, accept the money that we give scholarships to students, even though it might be tainted money? At which point do you, as she was saying in West End, accept the money to sell your house, which will be sold 7 times more? At which point do you put your individual need for recognition second in relation to the need of the community, and see yourself in this humiliated man in this? And at which point do you agree to envision the possibility to sacrifice even your own self for the benefits of the greater community, even if that means self-destruction? So these are big questions, and I agree. I love how you finished it, your presentation, with inviting students to think about what it means, and at which point are we culprit, at which point are we complicit, at which point are we guilty, and what can we do from it? Let's not have sorrow and say, I'm guilty, I can do love, or whatever it is, and see what you can do, and the tensions between the individual, especially in the West, and the larger needs of the community. So what do we value? What do we? But I think how you started and how you finished is magnificent, because one of the first points you had was the imbalance of power, or power relations. And that's all what this is about. It's about power relation, and it's about the imbalance of power.
I just want to say thank you to the facilitators and all of you for attending and participating in this discussion. And we will carry on monthly meetings like this and explore more of these very important issues and topics. Good luck. We'll pass this down from tomorrow. I don't know how many of you are teaching tomorrow, but good luck.
Is there any ways we can get those who may have lost their reader? I don't know when
Check
mine.
with,
Do we check with Crystal, or do we check with First in the World?
I think it's Crystal, right?
Is it Crystal, or is it First in the World who has the books?
Do you have Chris, or, I don't know, I'll check with Crystal, if she will tell you.
Because I don't know where my 112 book is.
But thank you so much. I appreciate your very thorough preparation for this presentation. And we will meet to discuss the question about the final exam. Please think about it. And don't forget the form that Frank gave you all.
Yes,
about the
about the